Okay, this is Block 7, British Generation, Section 7, the War in the Pacific, 1944. In 1942, the tide of the war had been turned at Midway. In 1943, the Americans had secured Guadalcanal here in the Solomons. And what happened in 1944 is the island hopping towards Tokyo would begin. That the distances here are vast, and from its original bases in Hawaii and Midway and now down in the Solomons, the Americans would begin leapfrogging their way up towards the Japanese home islands. There are two major thrusts, and we're not going to get into all of these involve terrible, bloody battles. We're not going to get into too much detail about them. One of them is led by General MacArthur. General MacArthur begins in the southeast corner of New Guinea and begins hopping his way up towards here and then with an aim towards the Philippines. On the northern axis of advance is led by Admiral Chester Nimitz, starting kind of from Midway and hopping his way this way across the Pacific and also up to these island chains as well. They begin converging on the Philippines. And there's a list of the battles, Tarawa and the Gilberts and the Marshalls in 1944. They all involve American amphibious assaults by the Marines on heavily fortified Japanese positions on these islands. Even the ones that are less heavily fortified as the less fortified islands, the Japanese are dug in, the Marines are incredibly brave, and each of these attacks on these little islands cause very large numbers of American casualties and very large numbers of Japanese casualties. In 1944, in the Marianas Islands, which are these over here, the largest naval battle, one of the largest naval battles of the war took place. Japanese Navy, what was left of it after Midway, kind of came down to the Marianas in order to attempt to block the American advance along in the central Pacific Island. However, by this time, the United States had so far surpassed Japan in terms of the amount of stuff it could make that at this battle, which became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the United States had something like 10 aircraft carriers to the Japanese 3. The amount of stuff that the United States had was much greater. And also, for the first time in the war, the American stuff begins to be much greater as well. At the top, you see a Japanese Zero, which in 1940-41 was a top flight plane in the world. However, the Japanese kind of figured that the Zero would be good enough for the rest of the war, and they never produced really another mass-produced fighter. However, the Americans replaced the F-4 with the F-6, down here seen, which is a much better airplane, is a much more powerful plane, more heavily armored plane, more heavily armed plane. And in the American, so many Japanese pilots were killed at Midway that the new pilots that the Japanese had to put into their now less good qualitatively machines made for a really uneven fight. And that's why it was called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. That at the cost of only 29 American planes, over 250 Japanese planes were destroyed. By 1944, the American pilots are better, they are flying better machines, and there are more of them. And the Marianas Islands fell to the United States. The Marianas Islands had to be taken because the United States wished to begin the strategic bombing of Japan's home islands. And the plane that was used to do that was the most advanced airplane in the world at the time. This is a B-29 Superfortress. It is much bigger, much more technologically advanced than the B-17s that flew over Europe. You can see it is a huge plane with a massive wingspan, a huge tail, 4 gigantic propeller-driven engines. And this plane had the range to go this airplane, this B-29, had the range to fly from the Marianas Islands over the Japanese home cities and back. And the American bombing of Japan began to be merciless. Japan's cities in 1944 are made up mostly of wood and paper, and this makes an incredible target for American bombers. That the fires that begin in Japanese cities, Tokyo, are massive, that the buildings just go up in flames, that a bombing on March 9th, March 10th, 1945 kills over 80,000 Japanese in Tokyo. Firestorms are created. A firestorm is a phenomenon where there is so much fire that is so hot, the heat literally creates hurricane-force winds of fire because it's just so big and so hot and so powerful. And these firestorms kind of ravaged through many Japanese cities, but still the Japanese would not surrender, would not even consider surrender. They had this giant army still in China, they held lots of territory, but by 1944 these American bombers from the American base in the Marianas are wreaking havoc on the Japanese home islands. Meanwhile, American submarines became much more technologically advanced. When the war began, American submarines, and especially American torpedoes, were catastrophically bad. But again, this American ingenuity and this American power and this American economic strength allowed the United States to produce hundreds of submarines, and they just prowled around underneath the water of Japan's Asian empire, sinking merchant ships left and right. Japan is like Britain in the sense that it has to trade to survive, and these American submarines are doing a greater number on Japan's merchant ships than the German U-boats ever did on the British. By the end of the war, over 90% of Japan's merchant vessels had been sunk, mostly by American submarines. And then in late 1944, the Americans converged, as MacArthur had promised, on the Philippine Islands. There was one more attempt by the Japanese to defeat the American Navy at the Battle of Leyte Gulf. It is the largest naval battle in all of history, and it is completely one-sided. There are about 25 American aircraft carriers and 4 Japanese, and they're not even filled up with planes. There's an old school battleship fight during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, but it's completely one-sided. What the Battle of Leyte Gulf becomes famous for historically is the Japanese were starting to give up on traditional Western-style warfare and introduced the kamikaze. What a kamikaze was a volunteer who willingly committed suicide. They loaded up planes, old planes, they didn't have to be new technologically advanced planes, they could be old planes, fill them up with explosives, fill them up with fuel, fill them up with bombs, and then there was a ceremony where the pilot, drank a cup of tea, put on a big white headband, and then took off and tried to crash his plane into an American ship. And they were known as kamikaze fighters after a famous 13th century battle between China and Japan. And the word in Japanese kamikaze means divine wind. That in this 800-year-old battle, a Chinese invasion force was swept away by a typhoon. A divine wind came and saved Japan from Chinese invasion. These suicide attackers became known as kamikazes. Dozens of ships and thousands of lives were lost due to these fanatical Japanese pilots. And the Americans started to get the sense that they were not fighting a traditional European enemy that would surrender when all else failed, but they were literally fighting an enemy that would fight to the death of every single soldier and to the death of every single Japanese person there was. And this freaked out the Americans. They did not like these kamikazes for lots of different reasons. Regardless, the kamikazes did not change the overall strategic equation, and MacArthur was ready to return to the Philippines by late 1944.